All right, looks like we are live, folks. Welcome. Happy Monday. Today we're going to take a look at one of my photography topics. This is Photography Monday here on the Creative Cloud. And we're going to take a look at actually a fairly new slider in both Lightroom and Photoshop. And if you're a Lightroom user, you probably have already used it or heard of it. And if you're a Photoshop user, maybe you haven't, but it's called the texture slider. And the texture slider is designed, as the name implies, to add, but also remove texture from your photos. So I'm going to show you the benefits of using this particular slider and when you would use it to add texture and maybe when you would use it to not add texture or remove texture from a photo. So I'm just scrolling down here and waiting on this one page to load so I can see your comments. Let's scroll down a little bit more. There we go. Now let's click and see if I can actually see your comments. And I see a bunch of folks already looking on YouTube. So Valder, Mark, Colleen, Steve, Kay, Bill, Michael, Jack, Jacomi, Javin, Gerald, Wolfgang, and Patsy, welcome. And let's see if I can get this window to finally load. It's like taking so long. There we go. Mamunu, if I'm saying that correctly. If not, I apologize. Jules, Mark on Facebook, welcome. Dale, Victoria's in the house. Let's see if I see anybody else. Chucky, welcome everybody. And if I missed your name, I apologize. But thanks for joining me today on this beautiful Monday afternoon, at least here in Atlanta, and hopefully it's beautiful wherever you are as well. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at, this should be quick. It shouldn't take that long. We're only really going to deal with one effect and one thing and what it does. And like I said, we're going to talk about the texture slider. And let me just do one thing, make sure this photo is ready to go before I go into it, before I show you. And it is. Okay, great. All right, so let's switch over to the computer so you guys can see what I'm doing. And here I've got Lightroom open. Don't worry if you're not a Lightroom user. I'm going to show you how to do this in Photoshop as well, so you'll be able to see it in both applications. And again, I am working with Lightroom Classic right now. So even if you're on the standard Lightroom, which is the cloud version, it works there as well. So the texture slider is across the board. It's in both versions of Lightroom, and it's in Photoshop's Camera Raw and Camera Raw filter. So let's talk about what it is and what it does and why you would use it and when you would use it and when is it best to use and so forth and so on. So for example, let's open up this photo I took in Egypt. That's me standing down there in front of one of the Great Pyramids. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this photo. And this photo was taken, I think I did this on a tripod, so it was kind of steady and it took a nice shot. And everything looks in focus, everything looks good. It looks nice and sharp, but you'll never really realize how sharp a photo can be until you A, sharpen it more, and B, use the new texture on it. So let's just zoom into those rocks like we have. Let's go over to develop. And in the basic panel in develop, you will see under presence, the new texture slider. It's right above clarity. And you're probably going to ask the question, well, what's the difference between clarity and texture? And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But let's go ahead and drag it to the right, and you can immediately start to see the difference in those rocks. They just like come alive as opposed to no texture. Adding texture, the rocks just get so much sharper. They get so much more oomph to them, for lack of a better word. And if I take it the other way, they get kind of dull and blurry and fuzzy in the background because the texture slider starts at 0 and can go in either direction. So you can add more texture to photos and you can remove texture from photos when you don't want them. So when would you add texture? When would be a good time to do it? And hang on for a minute here. My computer's asking me to restart for an update. No, I don't want to do that. You add it for things that you want to look sharper. Objects, landscapes, rocks, cars, metal, anything that you want to add that extra level of sharpness to. It could be like a flower. It could be anything that has hard edges That's typically when you want to do it. So for example, I'll go to this, this other photo here of the Sphinx. And for example, if I zoom into this area, looks good, no problem with it. Zoom into the eye, looks good, no problem with it. But if I go into develop and then I go to basic and I grab the texture slider and drag it to the right, you just see that the rocks and the little pores in the rocks just have so much more depth and detail. Now, again, if you were asking, well, Terry, what's the difference between that and clarity? I thought clarity did that. And you would be right. Clarity was originally the concept for doing that. And you would say, well, does this replace clarity? Is this now the better way to do it? Do I not need clarity anymore? Let's see the difference. So I'll zoom out so you can see it. And texture just adds texture. The image just looks better. It looks sharper. It looks better just overall. But if I turn the texture off and add clarity, clarity does something in addition to making the image sharper. It actually adjusts the tonal values. So you will see increased shadows. You might see increased detail, or you'll see increased detail, but you might see the brightness change of the photo. So again, if I move the clarity slider over, look at those shadows, especially around the ear. They get darker, especially around the rocks or the stones in the pyramid. They get darker. So if that's the effect I wanted, clarity would be better. If it's not the effect I want, texture would be better. So would I just use one versus the other? Maybe. It depends on the photo. So what I'm trying to say here is texture is not one of those things where, okay, I'll just use texture now and I'll never use clarity again. It would really depend. Is there a situation where I would ever use them both? Yeah, I use them both all the time. I don't use as much clarity because I don't want the tonal values to change, but I'll do a little bit of clarity and a little bit more of texture depending on the photo. All right, so now let's zoom out. I'm going to show you some examples in Photoshop now. So let's pop over to Photoshop. There's Photoshop, and same thing. I got this nice African elephant here, and let's go into the filter menu. And the first thing we would do to make this non-destructive is we would convert for smart filters. So that's like kind of a basic step just in general. Now that converted the layer into a smart object, or convert the background to a smart object, and now we can go to the filter menu, and now we can come down to camera raw filter. So you can do this on any layer. It does not have to be a raw file. It could be a JPEG. It could be just a layer of a multi-layered Photoshop file, and then away you go. All right, so for example, let's zoom in. All right, zoom in, not that much. Zoom out, there we go. And let's grab the texture slider, and once again, we can really see the texture come out in this beautiful animal. And if we take it the other way, we can see really what it's doing. So that's removing texture, and that's adding texture. All right, so adding texture, and again, if I do clarity, it will depend on the photo. Like this one, the shadows aren't getting as dark, so maybe all I need was clarity. But it's adding a little bit more detail, or I should keep saying detail. It's adding a little bit more shadow content in this photo that I may or may not want. So again, I might bump up the clarity just a bit and then augment it with texture if I needed to adjust those tonal values. If I didn't, then I go the other way. And yes, clarity works the opposite as well. You can remove clarity from a photo, but texture is definitely my go-to now for any landscape work that I'm doing, any non-people work. Now, does that mean it can't be used on people? It absolutely can be used on people. It depends on what you want to do. So for example, let's bump up the texture on this one. We click OK. And that will apply it. And because it's a non-destructive effect, I can always turn it off. I can always double click on it, get right back to it. And I can say, no, more texture. Let's add more. Let's click OK. And again, if I don't like it, turn it off or go back in and turn it down. So that's actually a nice subtle effect. If turn it off, the photo looked fine. But turn it on, the photo looks better, but it's not over the top. It's not like you did something to this photo. That's what you don't want people to say. You don't want to drag it so far that it looks obvious that you've done something in post-production. The other thing to look for when you're dragging these sliders around is that you don't want to, whatever slider it is, dehaze, clarity, texture, whatever, if you go too far, depending on what the slider is and depending on what the photo is, you might see a halo start to form around your image, like a glow. That's a dead giveaway that you've gone too far with whatever slider you just adjusted. So you want to step back, zoom back out, look around your photo because you don't want to introduce any artifacts because you pull the slider too far to try and get a certain area. Now, speaking of that exact situation, let's take a look at a person. In this case, we have a portrait. Nothing wrong with this portrait. Looks totally fine. If I were to add texture to maybe bring out the eyes or bring out the hair, it's also going to negatively affect the skin. And vice versa. If I pull the texture back to soften the skin, it's going to soften everything. And that's what we don't want as well. So when you're working with portraits, you don't usually want to do a global adjustment. You just don't want to drag the slider one way or the other because it's going to affect everything. That's where the adjustment brush comes in. So we'll go to our filter menu. We'll come down to convert for smart filters so it's non-destructive. And then we go right back into, not liquify, camera raw filter. There we go. We zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, zoom in. And this is what I mean. So if I go positive texture, look at her eyes. Her eyes get nice and great, but look at under, oh my God, the skin is starting to look bad because that's not how her skin looks. We're making her skin look worse, trying to bring out the hair and the detail in the eyes. If we go the other way to soften the skin, oh, the skin looks beautiful, more beautiful. It looks great. But then you're softening everything. You don't want that either. So what you want to do, leave texture alone for a minute, or actually, let's say that we want to decrease it a little bit to start off. Oh, I'm sorry. No, leave texture alone, put it back on 0, and instead go to your adjustment brush. You've got the adjustment brush in Lightroom, you've got the adjustment brush in Camera Raw, and the Camera Raw filter. So the letter K brings up the adjustment brush. And the adjustment brush has its own sliders. So there's texture, make sure everything else is zeroed out because you don't want to add something else in the photo. And now I'm just going to bring the texture down just a hair. Actually, I'm going to bring it down a lot because I'm going to adjust it back up once I see all the areas that I painted. Now I'm going to grab a stylus. You can do this with a mouse, but a stylus is so much easier. And I'm just going to go ahead and start adding negative texture on the skin. Now this is too much. This is over the top. But again, I did it so much so I can see where I'm doing it. Because if you only do a subtle amount, you're probably going to miss spots unless you check an overlay to see where you did it and where you didn't do it. But just adding a bunch will tell you, oh, I see a spot where there's not a significant amount, so I must have missed painting that area. All right, and I'm not going to do everything, but you get the idea. We go in, we get all the areas that we want to soften, and in skin retouching, negative texture is awesome. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to remove pores. You don't want it to look like plastic. You don't want to do all the bad things that gives retouching a bad name. You just want to basically subtly make a difference. All right, so that's too much, but at least I know I've covered all the areas. Now I can bring the texture slider up on the skin or down a little on the skin, not too much. She still needs to look like she looks. She still needs to look the age she looks. You're not trying to make a 50-year-old person look 20. You might be making a 50-year-old person look like they're 48, 45, just a little younger, whatever your client and you decide. But this would be probably around the amount of texture I would negatively apply to this skin. We don't want to go too far. We don't want to go in the other direction unless it's a guy. Guys, we tend to add more texture to because no one cares. And actually, you want the skin to look rough on a guy. On female subjects, we tend to make the skin look a little softer. So, and I mean a little, not a lot. Now, let's say that I did want to go the other way. I want to add texture to the hair and to the eyes and areas that I want to have a little bit more detail. So in that case, we would click New. So right here on the adjustment brush, we want a new brush. We want the ability to paint without affecting what we just did. We want a new one. So this way I can go and click New. It gives me a new brush, and I can go texture the other way without affecting the one that I already did. And I can do the eyes. There we go. Make those eyes nice and detailed, nice and detailed. I can go here and get the hair, any jewelry, anything that you would want to have actually more detail in it. You get another pinpoint. So that pinpoint is the new one. That's where I started brushing first. This is the old one. And as I hover over the old one, I can see any spots I would have missed. So if I go back to the old one, I can go in and say, oh, you know what? I didn't really get that area. And this one will hover and show me the areas that I just did. So whichever pin you select, that's the effect you're doing. So this is the pin for positive texture. This is the pin for negative texture. And I can add as many new pins or as many new adjustments as I want. So the beauty of this is that, again, it's all non-destructive. These pins don't go away. You can always come back in and adjust or delete them or do whatever you want. So Colleen, I think I just already answered your question. Colleen was asking, is this only global? And no, it's not. You can use the adjustment brush and use it anywhere you want. Now, let's say, for example, I do another new one and I come down here. We don't want more texture. Let's say we want to change maybe the color. So we can go in blue, click OK. And now I'm adding blue to her outfit. So you can also use the adjustment brush in creative ways, like I'm using it right now. It's not always for adjusting something. It's sometimes used to change something, again, non-destructively. So while I've got that, I can make it more saturated, less saturated. I can do whatever I want to that adjustment any way that I want it. More saturated actually looks like a deeper blue. Let's do that. And again, I have all three pins to choose from. The sharpening, more texture pin, the softening, the less texture pin, and the blue pin for changing the color of part of my photo. Hey, Rob Sylvan, what's going on? Rob Sylvan, great Lightroom guy. He knows this stuff inside and out. Great instructor for Lightroom. Okay, so once I click OK, that's been applied again as a smart filter. If we zoom in, we can see our before and after by turning it off. Again, subtle change, not a big deal. Turning it on, I can see the skin get a little softer when I turn it back on. Turn it off, I can see a little bit more texture in there where I didn't apply it. And turn it on, that skin got a little softer, the eye got a little bit better, or sharper I should say, and the blue came in as well. So turn it off, not blue, turn it on, blue. So retouching with this for people is always about subtle changes. You shouldn't be trying to make a drastic change to someone's appearance like that. So subtle, make them look great, make them look like they look in person. All right, I assume adjustments, portraits you made are also good for Lightroom. Lightroom Mobile, absolutely. Since you have selective adjustments in Lightroom Mobile, everything I just showed you would work on your phone or your tablet as well. And you have the texture slider in mobile as well. So with that said, and Rob, I can't imagine you learned something that you didn't already know, so I'd be curious to know what that was. But with that said, cheers everybody. This is a great new addition to Lightroom and Camera Raw and Lightroom Mobile. Go play around with it. Go add some texture to your photos. Go remove some texture from your photos. And just make your photos look better, which is the whole point of this with the texture slider. Hey, Luca, welcome all the way from Italy. So with that said, cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we will catch you, Dennis, yes, we will catch you on the next one. Bye, everybody.